In 2018, it was documented that not only were his televised sermons seen by approximately 10 million viewers all over the US, they were also seen by several million more in over 100 countries around the world. He makes approximately $55 million each year from his books and speaking engagements, as well as the church's gift shop and apparel line. In 2017, his net worth was reported to be between $40 million and $60 million US dollars.
What? Who?
It's Joel Scott Osteen.
Who the f*** is that again?
Osteen was born on March 5th in 1963 in Houston, Texas. He is one of 6 children to John Osteen and Dolores Pilgrim. His father, a former Southern Baptist pastor, founded the Lakewood Church that employs Joel now. As a teenager, Joel was just like you and me. He hung out with friends, graduated from Humboldt High School in 1981, and later went off to study radio and television communications at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. After less than a year of university, Joel dropped out to help his father develop Lakewood Church's growing national television ministry, working behind the scenes as a producer of the church's broadcasts. It would interest you to know that he did not receive a degree from Divinity School either, a school of theology dedicated to preparing individuals to serve as clergy members. Joel never wanted to become a pastor, despite his father repeatedly encouraging him, time and time again, to follow in his footsteps. He instead was perfectly content working behind the scenes of the televised sermons and did so for 17 years. He finally succumbed to his father's request one day in January 1999, when his father once again asked Joel to preach on Sunday, and Joel, at age 35, describes a shift inside him, and this time he agreed. His father was admitted to the hospital 3 days before Joel's first sermon due to kidney complications. Joel's first sermon was the last sermon his father ever heard via telephone. Upon returning to the hospital to see his father after the sermon, Joel says, quote, "The nurses stopped me in the hallway and they said, 'Joel, we have never seen your dad so proud. He just beamed with joy,'" end quote. The next Friday, January 23rd, John Osteen had a heart attack and died. All of a sudden, Joel and his wife, Victoria, were suddenly thrown into a full-time leadership of Lakewood Church. Devastated with the loss of his father, Joel speaks out and said, quote, "What are the coincidences of me speaking the last Sunday of his life, because he was healthy for the most part," end quote. After coping with his father's death, Joel describes another internal shift that he explains how he was supposed to step up and become pastor to the church. Despite thoughts of doubt and inadequacy, he persisted and took over Lakewood Church shortly after. Joel describes trying to give sermons with his father's fiery Orthodox style because he assumed that's what people expected from him. But he explains how that never felt natural or right. On an interview with Oprah on Super Soul, Joel articulates how he realized about 3 to 4 months in how he's not good at being his father. His father had a fiery style where he is more laid back and often used that calm energy to inspire people. He said, quote, "I read a scripture that said, 'David fulfilled his purpose for his generation.' I felt like I heard something here. I said, 'Joel, your dad fulfilled his purpose. Now go be you,'" end quote. Clearly, this shift paid off because within a few years, his weekly televised broadcast had a viewership in more than 100 countries and became the top-rated inspirational program on air. Joel would later go on to write and publish several books, and in 2004, his book, Your Best Life Now, 7 Steps to Living at Your Full Potential, became a bestseller. But Joel wanted more. He explains how, quote, "Half the people who watch us don't even go to church, and so that was our goal. How do we get outside of the church? I want to talk to the people who think I'm not a religious person. When Jesus was here, he didn't stay in the synagogue. He went out into the marketplace. And so that's what we try to do," end quote. So in 2005, Joel directed a 15-city US tour, preaching to crowds at every stop. That same year, his church opened a new mega church in Houston Compact Center, which seats over 16,000 people. Holy crap, that's a lot of people. Weekly attendance at Lakewood continued to grow from 6,000 in 1999 to a whopping 50,000 by 2016. His father would surely be proud knowing how Joel is growing his legacy. He received the nickname the Smiling Preacher by his congregation, and he tries to avoid dense or traditional theology in his sermons. Instead, he tries to deliver upbeat and motivational messages. However, he has received backlash for this approach, as some people argue that it is a, quote, watered down interpretation of Christianity, end quote. Others accuse him of promoting prosperity gospel, made to justify the accumulation of wealth. Joel defended his approach by saying he wanted to remain focused on the goodness of God, and that he has never defined prosperity in solely materialistic terms. He also defended his church by saying that his seemingly commercial approach is to attract new members, and churches that do not change with the times risk losing members of their congregation. Now at this time you're probably wondering, how does this guy do it? A growing congregation? A best-selling author? What about his wife? Does he have any children? Well, Joel met his wife Victoria in 1985 when he wandered into a bookstore that she worked at after school with her mother. The two have been married for 33 years and have 2 children together, a son, John Osteen, 24, and a daughter, Alexandra Osteen, 21. The children work with their parents at Lakewood, and Jonathan hopes to one day step into his father's shoes as a pastor of Lakewood, like father, like son. Joel's older siblings, Paul, Lisa, and Tamara, and his younger sister, April, are all involved in the ministry as well, in one form or another. As for his half-brother, Justin, he does ministry work in New York City. Joel lives with his family in a 17,000 square foot mansion in River Oaks, Texas, which has 5 fireplaces, 6 bedrooms, 3 elevators, a guest house, a pool house, and an outdoor pool, which is estimated to be valued at $10.5 million. This guy sounds flawless, right? A dreamy pastor straight out of Houston, Texas, dropped out of college to help televise his father's sermons, growing his legacy to a multi-million-dollar establishment, kissing babies and shaking hands with the elderly, and he's a best-selling author? Sounds downright perfect, right? Wrong. No one is perfect. Not even a charismatic pastor from Houston, Texas. In late August 2017, Hurricane Harvey tragically hit Texas and Louisiana, killing 89 people and causing $126.3 billion in damages, and resulting in more than 30,000 people to heartbreakingly lose their homes. Osteen was condemned on social media after it was reported that his church turned away people seeking asylum from the hurricane. Joel later disputed these claims by arguing that his church was open from the beginning and was always open. The notion that stated that the church was not a shelter and that they were not taking people in were false allegations. Following the media's backlash, it was later announced that Lakewood would be receiving people and distributing supplies to the needy. Furthermore, according to an interview with Fox News, when asked if he thinks homosexuality is a sin, Joel replied by saying, quote, "Homosexuality is a sin, according to my interpretation of scripture. But gay people are welcome in my church without judgment," end quote. In that same interview with Chris Wallace, when asked to address the fact that people think he's a gay hater and gay basher, Joel defends his views by saying, quote, "I'm not. I don't dislike anybody. Gays are some of the nicest, kindest, most loving people in the world. But my faith is based on what I believe the scripture says, and that's the way I read the scripture," end quote. When asked whether he thinks homosexual couples should have the same rights as heterosexual couples, Joel states that he supports some rights, but does not think they should have equal rights.
Oh my God.
Is he really changing with the times, or is he stuck in the last century? Remember when I reminded you guys that no one is perfect? Well, that also applies to the beautiful Victoria Osteen. On August 6, 2008, a jury of her peers were seated. Among them, 7 men and 5 women, in a civil lawsuit asserting that Victoria assaulted a flight attendant on a Continental Airlines flight. The flight attendant, Sharon Brown, claims that Victoria assaulted her before the flight took off in 2005 from Houston to Vail, Colorado. According to News Channel 10, Brown states that she, quote, "threw her against the bathroom door and elbowed her in the left breast during an angry outburst over a stain on her first-class seat," end quote. The flight attendant not only wanted an apology, but also disciplinary damages amounting to 10% of Victoria's net worth. The Osteen's lawyer, Rusty Hardin, argued that the flight attendant's claim was false and that what happened on the flight was just a minor incident. Moreover, some of the jurors stated that they were starstruck with the Osteens and admitted that this might affect their judgment in the case, as many jurors admitted to attending Lakewood Church in the past and having read Joel's books. One potential female juror even said, quote, "If Victoria did assault Miss Brown, God sees that and she will be punished in her own way," end quote. As a good husband, Joel stood by and supported his wife through the case, and after only 2 hours of deliberation, Victoria was found not guilty over the altercation. Overall, there's no denying that the Osteens are influential people to not only their congregation in Texas, but all over America. They often hold sermons and concerts of hope in many states, including Arizona, where the prominent football player Rob Gronkowski attended university. Rob Gronkowski? Rob Gronkowski?
Who? Huh? Who the is that again?